I never thought my 35th birthday would be the day my world came crashing down. But life has a funny way of surprising you, doesn't it? It was a crisp autumn evening in suburban Boston. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the neighborhood in warm hues of red and gold. I'd spent the entire day preparing for what I hoped would be a perfect celebration. My husband, Tom, had promised me a special dinner with our closest family and friends. I wanted everything to be just right. Our modest two-story home was filled with the aroma of roasting chicken and freshly baked apple pie, my specialty. I'd scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, arranged fresh flowers on the dining table, and even splurged on a new dress for the occasion. It was burgundy, form-fitting, and made me feel beautiful for the first time in months. As guests began to arrive, I greeted them with a smile that barely hid my nervous excitement. There was my best friend Sarah, who'd been by my side since high school. Tom's parents, Richard and Margaret, always impeccably dressed and slightly intimidating. My sister-in-law Jessica and her husband Mike, their twin boys racing past me to find their cousins. And of course, my own parents, looking proud but slightly out of place in the world I'd built for myself. The dining room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Wine flowed freely, and plates were piled high with the feast I'd prepared. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, to bask in the warmth of having all these people I cared about under one roof. If only I'd known what was coming. It started innocently enough. Margaret, my mother-in-law, stood up, tapping her glass with a silver spoon. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. I felt a flutter of anticipation in my chest, thinking perhaps she was about to say something nice. After all, we'd never been close, but surely on my birthday. "I'd like to propose a toast," Margaret announced, her voice carrying that crisp, upper-class Boston accent that had always made me feel slightly inferior. "To Claire, on her 35th birthday." I smiled, waiting for the kind words I was sure would follow. But then I saw it, that slight curl of her lip, the glint in her eye that I'd learned to recognize over the years. My stomach dropped. "Claire," she continued, raising her glass higher, "you've always been, well, let's be honest. You've always been a bit of a loser, haven't you?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I heard a few nervous chuckles, saw Sarah's eyes widen in shock. But mostly, I felt the weight of every gaze in the room, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "I mean," Margaret went on, seemingly oblivious to the tension she'd created, "look at where you came from. That little town in New Hampshire, was it? Barely a dot on the map. And now here you are, playing at being one of us. It's almost admirable, in a way. Like watching a child in grown-up clothes." I couldn't breathe. My cheeks burned with humiliation as I looked around the table, silently pleading for someone, anyone, to stop this. My eyes landed on Tom, sitting next to his mother. Surely he would say something, defend me against this cruel attack. But Tom just sat there, swirling the wine in his glass, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Was he agreeing with her? "But I suppose we should be grateful," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "After all, where would Thomas be without you? Someone needs to keep this house clean, cook his meals, take care of the children. You've found your place, haven't you, Claire? Right where you belong." The room had gone deathly quiet. I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting off the seconds of this endless moment. My father half rose from his chair, his face red with anger, but my mother placed a restraining hand on his arm. Even they didn't know how to react to this public humiliation. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile onto my face. "Thank you, Margaret," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. That was enlightening. And just like that, the spell was broken. Conversations resumed, albeit more subdued than before. Forks clinked against plates, wine glasses were refilled. Everyone seemed determined to pretend that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But for me, everything had changed. As I mechanically went through the motions of serving dessert and refilling drinks, my mind was in turmoil. Had they always seen me this way? Was I really just the help, tolerated but never truly accepted? I caught glimpses of concerned looks from Sarah, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. My parents left early, my father muttering angrily under his breath. I wanted to run after them, to escape this house that suddenly felt like a prison, but I couldn't. I was the hostess, after all. I had a role to play. As the night wore on, I found myself retreating more and more. I stopped trying to engage in conversations, stopped forcing that painful smile. No one seemed to notice. They were too busy enjoying the food I'd prepared, the wine I'd chosen, the home I'd made beautiful. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped out the back door into the cool night air, sinking onto the porch steps. The sounds of the party drifted out to me, muffled laughter and the clink of glasses. I stared up at the stars, trying to remember the last time I'd felt truly happy in this life I'd built. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in thought. But eventually, I heard the door open behind me. It was Tom, probably wondering where I'd disappeared to. "Hey," he said, his words slightly slurred. "What are you doing out here?" "The party's inside." I looked up at him, really looked at him for what felt like the first time in years. This man I'd married, thinking we were building a life together. Had he ever truly seen me? "Your mother," I began, not even sure what I wanted to say. Tom waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, you know how she gets after a few glasses of wine. Don't take it personally." "Don't take it personally?" The casual cruelty of his response stunned me into silence. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, why don't you come back inside? We're about to cut the cake." I nodded numbly, letting him pull me to my feet. As we walked back into the house, into the warmth and light and laughter, I felt like a ghost. Present, but not really there. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I cut the cake, opened presents, thanked everyone for coming. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Tom's steady breathing beside me, I realized a terrible truth. I was alone. Completely and utterly alone. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked 3:17 a.m., its red glow the only light in our bedroom. I lay there, wide awake, my mind replaying the events of my birthday dinner like a torturous film reel. Tom's steady breathing beside me felt more isolating than comforting. How had we gotten here? I turned my head to look at him, studying the profile I once found so handsome. In sleep, the lines of stress that usually creased his forehead were smooth, making him look younger, almost vulnerable. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful image with the man who had sat silently while his mother tore me apart. As I watched him sleep, memories flooded my mind. I remembered the day we met, 10 years ago, at a coffee shop in downtown Boston. I was fresh out of college, bright-eyed and full of dreams, working as an entry-level marketing assistant. Tom was already established in his father's law firm, confident and charming in his tailored suit. He'd smiled at me over his latte, and I'd felt my heart skip a beat. Our whirlwind romance had been the stuff of fairy tales, at least in the beginning. Fancy dinners, weekend getaways, surprise flowers at my tiny apartment. When he proposed after just 6 months, I'd said yes without hesitation. I thought I was living my dream. But now, lying in the dark, I forced myself to look at our relationship with clear eyes. When had things started to change? When had I become less of a partner and more of a servant? It started small, I realized. Tom working later and later, leaving me to handle more of the household chores. His mother's snide comments about my background, my lack of proper upbringing. The way Tom would laugh them off, telling me not to be so sensitive. Then came the bigger things. The promotion I turned down because Tom said it would interfere with his career plans. The friends I slowly lost touch with because they didn't fit into Tom's social circle. The way I gradually stopped voicing my opinions at dinner parties, afraid of embarrassing him. I thought of all the times I'd swallowed my pride, bit my tongue, played the role of the perfect wife. And for what? To be publicly humiliated on my own birthday? A wave of anger washed over me, so intense it made my hands shake. I clenched them into fists, pressing them against my eyes until I saw stars. How dare they treat me this way? How dare Tom let them? I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and padded downstairs to the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the noise and bustle of the party just hours before. Empty wine glasses and dirty plates still littered the dining room table. I'd been too upset to clean up after everyone left. Mechanically, I began to tidy, gathering plates and loading the dishwasher. It was a familiar routine, one I'd performed countless times. But tonight, every dish felt like an accusation. Every wine stain on the tablecloth a reminder of how little they respected me. As I wiped down the table, my eyes fell on the stack of birthday cards I'd received. On top was one from Tom's law firm colleagues, addressed to Mrs. Thomas Aldridge. Not Claire. Not even Claire Aldridge. Just an extension of my husband. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the cards and ripped them in half, then quarters, then eighths. Bits of colored paper fluttered to the floor like confetti. I stood there, breathing heavily, surrounded by the destroyed remnants of my birthday wishes. What had happened to me? When had I become this person, so desperate for approval that I'd let myself be walked all over? I made my way to the living room, sinking into the plush armchair by the window. Outside, the street was dark and silent, the neighbors' houses looming like shadowy sentinels. I'd always loved our neighborhood with its tree-lined streets and well-manicured lawns. Now, it felt like a gilded cage. My eyes fell on a framed photo on the mantel. It was from our wedding day, me in a flowing white gown, Tom looking dashing in his tuxedo. We were both smiling, eyes shining with hope and promise. I remembered how I'd felt that day, so sure that we were embarking on a wonderful adventure together. But as I looked at that smiling bride, I barely recognized her. Where was that spark, that sense of possibility? When had I let it die? I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made over the years. The job opportunities I'd passed up to support Tom's career. The endless hours spent entertaining his clients, always with a smile plastered on my face. The way I'd learned to bite my tongue whenever his family made thinly veiled insults about my background. And what had I gotten in return? A husband who couldn't even be bothered to defend me against his own mother's cruel words. A life where I was valued not for who I was, but for what I could do for others. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't living my life. I was living the life Tom and his family had decided I should have. I thought about my parents, how they'd left the party early, my father fuming and my mother trying to calm him down. They'd never quite fit into this world Tom had brought me into, with its country club memberships and summer homes on the Cape. I'd always felt caught between two worlds, never fully belonging in either. But my parents had raised me to be strong, to stand up for myself. What would they think if they could see me now, reduced to this shadow of my former self? As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. I went to our home office, booting up the computer. With shaking hands, I logged into our joint bank account. The balance made me catch my breath, a small fortune, more money than I'd ever had growing up. But how much of it was really mine? I'd contributed to this household, even if it wasn't always financially. I'd managed our home, raised our children, supported Tom's career every step of the way. Didn't that count for something? Before I could talk myself out of it, I transferred a significant sum to my personal account, an account Tom didn't even know existed. It wasn't everything, not even close. But it was enough to give me options, enough to remind myself that I wasn't completely powerless. As I logged out of the account, I heard movement upstairs. Tom was awake. Soon, he'd come downstairs, kiss me on the cheek, and head off to work as if nothing had happened last night. As if my world hadn't been shattered. I quickly closed the browser and stood up, my heart pounding. But as I listened to Tom's familiar morning routine, the shower running, the closet door opening and closing, I felt strangely calm. For the first time in years, I had a secret, something that was just mine. I went to the kitchen and started the coffee maker, falling into the familiar rhythm of making Tom's breakfast. But inside, I felt different. The woman who woke up this morning was not the same one who went to bed last night. As I heard Tom's footsteps on the stairs, I took a deep breath. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living this way. Something had to change, and that change had to start with me. The question was, did I have the courage to make it happen? The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a beautiful New England autumn day that seemed to mock the turmoil churning inside me. I went through my usual routine on autopilot, making coffee, preparing breakfast, tidying up the kitchen. But everything felt different. The weight of my revelation from the night before hung heavy in the air, invisible but undeniable. Tom left for work with barely a goodbye, his mind already on the cases awaiting him at the office. As the door closed behind him, I stood in the sudden silence of our home, feeling like a stranger in my own life. I moved through the rooms, touching familiar objects, the antique vase Tom's mother had given us as a housewarming gift, the framed photos of our picture-perfect family vacations, the expensive throw pillows I'd agonized over choosing to match our decor. Each item held a memory, but now they all felt tainted, like props in a play I no longer wanted to perform. In our bedroom, I opened the closet and stared at the rows of designer clothes, most of them chosen to fit the image of the successful lawyer's wife. I ran my fingers along the silk blouses and tailored jackets, remembering how I'd once felt so proud to wear them. Now, they felt like costumes, reminders of a role I'd been playing for far too long. I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. When had I become this person? This shell of myself, perfectly groomed and styled, but empty inside? Without really thinking about it, I grabbed an old duffel bag from the back of the closet. It was the same bag I'd used to pack for college all those years ago, before I met Tom, before I became Mrs. Thomas Aldrich. I held it in my hands, feeling the worn fabric, and suddenly, I knew what I had to do. I started packing, but not in the frantic, desperate way I'd always imagined leaving would be. Instead, I moved with a strange calm, selecting items with purpose. A few comfortable outfits, practical shoes, my most treasured books. The locket my grandmother had given me on my 16th birthday. A small photo album filled with pictures from my life before Tom. As I packed, I realized how little I actually wanted to take with me. So much of what filled our house wasn't really mine. It belonged to the persona I'd created to fit into Tom's world. I went to my dresser and pulled out the small lockbox hidden in the back of the bottom drawer. Inside was my personal bank card, the one linked to the account I'd transferred money into last night. I slipped it into my wallet, replacing the joint credit card Tom and I shared. Next, I went to the home office and booted up the computer one last time. I spent the next hour methodically going through our shared accounts, bank statements, credit cards, investment portfolios. I didn't take anything else, but I made sure I had all the information I might need. Knowledge, I realized, was its own kind of freedom. As midday approached, I found myself in the kitchen again. Out of habit, I started preparing lunch, a salad with grilled chicken, Tom's usual. Halfway through slicing a tomato, I stopped, the knife hovering in midair. What was I doing? I wasn't going to be here when Tom came home for lunch. I wasn't going to be here ever again. I set the knife down and stepped back from the counter, looking around the kitchen. How many meals had I prepared here? How many dinner parties had I hosted, desperate to impress Tom's colleagues and clients? I thought of all the times I'd stood at this very spot, rehearsing conversations in my head, trying to come up with the perfect, witty responses to use at Tom's work functions. A wave of anger washed over me, sudden and fierce. I grabbed the plate with the half-prepared salad and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, leaving a constellation of broken porcelain and scattered greens on the pristine tile floor. For a moment, I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the mess I'd made. Then, slowly, I began to laugh. It bubbled up from deep inside me, slightly hysterical, but also strangely freeing. When was the last time I'd made a mess without immediately rushing to clean it up? Still chuckling, I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the broken plate and spilled food where it lay. Let Tom deal with it for once. I grabbed my packed bag from the bedroom and made one last sweep of the house. Did I need anything else? My eyes fell on the framed photo from our wedding day, still sitting on the mantel where I'd left it last night. I picked it up, studying the smiling faces captured in the picture. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of doubt. Was I really going to walk away from 10 years of marriage? from the life I'd worked so hard to build? But then I remembered the look on Tom's face at my birthday dinner, the way he'd sat there silently while his mother humiliated me. I thought of all the little compromises, all the times I'd swallowed my own desires to make his life easier. The young woman in the wedding photo deserved better than that. I deserved better than that. I placed the photo face down on the mantel and turned away. At the front door, I paused with my hand on the knob. Should I leave a note? But what would I say? How could I possibly explain in words the seismic shift that had occurred within me? No, I decided. I'd spent too many years explaining myself, justifying my feelings, trying to make others comfortable at the expense of my own well-being. This time, my actions would speak for themselves. I stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind me. The street was quiet, most of our neighbors away at work or school. Mrs. Henderson from next door was watering her prized roses, and she gave me a friendly wave. "Good morning, Claire," she called out. "Heading out for the day?" I smiled and nodded, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder. "Yes," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "I'm going on a trip." Mrs. Henderson beamed at me. "How lovely. I hope you have a wonderful time, dear." If only she knew. I walked down the driveway to my car, a sensible, mid-range sedan that Tom had insisted was perfect for a lawyer's wife. I tossed my bag in the back seat and slid behind the wheel. For a moment, I sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house I was leaving behind. From the outside, it looked perfect. The manicured lawn, the tasteful exterior, the curtains I'd so carefully chosen visible through the windows. It was the American dream, wasn't it? A beautiful home in a good neighborhood, a successful husband, financial security. But a home is more than just a house. A marriage is more than just sharing a last name. And security, well, I was beginning to realize that true security came from within, not from a hefty bank balance or a prestigious address. I started the car and pulled out of the driveway. As I drove down the tree-lined street, past the other perfect houses with their perfect lawns, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do next, but for the first time in years, I felt truly, exhilaratingly free. At the end of our street, I paused at the stop sign. Left would take me towards the city, towards the life I'd known for the past decade. Right would lead to the highway, to open roads and unknown possibilities. I turned right. As the familiar sights of my neighborhood faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the wider lanes of the highway, I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but it was mine to choose. I thought about Tom coming home for lunch, finding the broken plate in the kitchen, realizing I was gone. Would he be worried? Angry? Would he even care? I pushed the thoughts away. His reactions were no longer my concern. Instead, I focused on the road ahead, on the endless possibilities stretching out before me. I had some money, thanks to my secret transfer. I had my skills, my education, my determination. Most importantly, I had myself, the real me, not the carefully cultivated image of the perfect wife I'd been hiding behind for so long. As I merged onto the highway, joining the flow of traffic heading who knows where, I felt a laugh bubbling up inside me again. This time, it wasn't tinged with hysteria or bitterness. It was pure, unadulterated joy. I was starting over. At 35, with nothing but a bag of clothes and a head full of dreams, I was starting my life anew. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The highway signs flashed by: Boston, New York, Point South. Each one represented a potential new beginning, a different path my life could take. For now, I was content to drive, to put distance between myself and the life I was leaving behind. As the miles rolled by, I found myself singing along to the radio, something I hadn't done in years. My voice was rusty from disuse, but I didn't care. I sang at the top of my lungs, drumming my hands on the steering wheel, embracing the sense of freedom that came with the open road. I had no illusions that this would be easy. I knew there would be challenges ahead, finding a job, a place to live, rebuilding my life from scratch. There would likely be moments of doubt, of fear, maybe even regret. But as I drove towards an uncertain future, I felt more alive than I had in years. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. No more compromising my values, no more shrinking myself to fit someone else's expectations. I was Claire. Just Claire. And that was more than enough. The first day of my new life passed in a blur of highway miles and unfamiliar towns. I drove south with no real destination in mind, just a burning desire to put as much distance as possible between myself and the life I'd left behind. As night fell, I found myself in a small town somewhere in Pennsylvania, exhausted but exhilarated. I checked into a modest motel on the outskirts of town, paying cash to avoid using any cards that could be traced. The room was basic but clean, a far cry from the luxury I'd grown accustomed to. Yet as I sat on the edge of the bed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months, unburdened by the weight of expectations and pretense. When I woke the next morning, it took me a moment to remember where I was and why. But as the memories of the past few days came flooding back, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I spent that day exploring the town, losing myself in the anonymity of being a stranger. No one here knew me as Mrs. Thomas Aldridge, the lawyer's wife. I was just another face in the crowd, and it was liberating. As I sat in a small diner, savoring a cup of coffee that was a far cry from the artisanal brews Tom insisted on, I allowed myself to wonder what was happening back in Boston. Had Tom realized I was gone yet? What was he telling people? I imagined the scene. Tom coming home for lunch, finding the broken plate in the kitchen. At first, he'd probably be annoyed, thinking I'd had a clumsy moment and forgot to clean up. But then he'd call out my name, receiving no response. He'd check the bedroom, the study, growing increasingly confused and perhaps a little worried. Would he call my friends? My parents? I could picture the growing panic as he realized not only was I gone, but I'd left without taking much with me. No note, no explanation. Just gone. Part of me felt guilty for causing that panic, for disappearing without a word. But a larger part, the part that had been silenced for so long, felt a grim satisfaction. Let him worry. Let him feel a fraction of the uncertainty and fear I'd lived with for years. As the second day turned into the third, I half expected my phone to start ringing off the hook. But it remained silent. No calls, no texts, no frantic voicemails. The silence was deafening and surprisingly painful. Did they not care that I was gone? Or were they respecting my unspoken wish for space? I tried to push these thoughts aside, focusing instead on my next steps. I couldn't keep drifting forever. I needed a plan, a destination, a purpose. On the fourth day, as I was having breakfast at the same diner I'd come to favor, my phone suddenly sprang to life. The screen lit up with notifications, 30 missed calls, dozens of text messages, several voicemails. My heart raced as I scrolled through the list of names. Tom, his mother, his sisters, even some of his colleagues. With shaking hands, I listened to the first voicemail. It was Tom, his voice a mixture of anger and concern. Claire, where the hell are you? This isn't funny anymore. Whatever's going on, we can talk about it. Just come home, okay? The next was from his mother, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. Claire, darling, we're all so worried about you. This behavior is so unlike you. Thomas is beside himself. Please, let us know you're safe. Message after message, each one a mixture of concern, confusion, and thinly veiled accusations. As I listened, I felt a strange detachment, as if I was hearing about someone else's life. The last message was from Sarah, my best friend. Her voice was soft, worried, but understanding. Claire, honey, I hope you're okay. I think I understand why you left, and I want you to know I support you. Just, please let me know you're safe when you can. I love you. Tears pricked at my eyes as I listened to Sarah's message. In all the chaos of my departure, I hadn't even thought to reach out to her. She had always been there for me, even when I'd pulled away to focus on Tom's world. I made a mental note to call her soon when I felt ready. As I sat there, staring at my phone, a war raged inside me. Part of me wanted to respond, to explain, to justify my actions. But another part, the part that had given me the strength to walk away, knew that engaging would only pull me back into the world I was trying to escape. In the end, I settled for a simple text to Sarah: "I'm safe. I'll call when I can. Thank you for understanding." Then I turned off my phone, severing my last link to my old life. The rest of the day passed in a haze of conflicting emotions. Relief that I was missed, anger that it had taken my disappearance for them to show concern, guilt over the worry I was causing, and a fierce determination to stand my ground. As night fell, I found myself walking through a small park near my motel. The air was crisp with the promise of approaching winter, and the trees were ablaze with autumn colors. I sat on a bench, watching as families played on the nearby playground, couples walked hand in hand, and joggers pounded the paths. For the first time since I'd left, I allowed myself to truly feel the enormity of what I'd done. I'd walked away from my entire life, my home, my marriage, my social circle, everything I'd known for the past decade. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless. What had I done? Was I crazy to think I could just start over at 35? I had no job, no real plan, just a vague notion of finding myself again. The doubts that I'd been holding at bay came crashing in, threatening to overwhelm me. But as I sat there, watching the simple, everyday scenes of life unfolding around me, I felt a calm settling over me. Yes, I'd left everything behind. But in doing so, I'd opened up a world of possibilities. I thought about the Claire I used to be before I met Tom. The girl with big dreams and a fierce independence. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost her, buried her under layers of societal expectations and the desire to fit into a world that was never truly mine. Now, I had the chance to find her again, to rediscover my passions, my dreams, my sense of self. It wouldn't be easy. I had no illusions about that. But for the first time in years, I felt truly alive, truly present in my own life. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I made a promise to myself. No matter what happened next, no matter how hard things got, I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't settle for a life half-lived, for being a supporting character in someone else's story. From now on, I was the author of my own life. And it was time to start writing a new chapter. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. I knew I couldn't stay in this small town forever, as tempting as it was to hide away from the world. I needed to start building my new life. I spent hours in the local library, using their computers to job hunt and research affordable places to live. I updated my resume, removing any mentions of the volunteer work and charity organizations I'd been involved with as Tom's wife. Instead, I focused on my skills, my education, the person I was beneath the polished exterior of a lawyer's wife. It was harder than I expected. After years of defining myself in relation to Tom and his career, I struggled to articulate my own strengths and abilities. But slowly, as I worked on my resume and applied for jobs, I began to remember the ambitious, capable woman I used to be. I also started looking for a more permanent place to stay. As much as I'd enjoyed the anonymity of the motel, I knew I needed a real home base to start rebuilding my life. I focused on small cities, places where the cost of living was reasonable, but there were still job opportunities. After much deliberation, I settled on a small city in North Carolina. It was far enough from Boston to feel like a fresh start, but not so far that I felt completely untethered. I found a small, furnished apartment available for a short-term lease, perfect for someone starting over. The day before I was set to leave for North Carolina, I finally worked up the courage to call Sarah. My hands shook as I dialed her number, half afraid she wouldn't answer. But she picked up on the second ring, her voice a mixture of relief and concern. "Claire? Oh my God, are you okay?" "I'm okay," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "I'm sorry I worried you." There was a pause, and I could almost see Sarah choosing her words carefully. "Claire, what happened? Everyone's been going crazy trying to find you." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I left Sarah. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be that person anymore. To my surprise, Sarah didn't sound shocked. Instead, her voice was filled with understanding. "Oh, honey, I've been worried about you for a long time. I just didn't know how to help. We talked for hours, the words pouring out of me like a dam had broken. I told her everything, the years of subtle put-downs, the slow erosion of my self-esteem, the birthday dinner that had been the final straw. Sarah listened, offering words of support and understanding. "What are you going to do now?" she asked finally. "I'm starting over," I said, feeling a surge of excitement despite my nerves. "I've found a place to live. I'm job hunting. I don't know exactly what's next, but I know I need to do this." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I held my breath, waiting for her reaction. "I'm proud of you, Claire," she said finally. "It takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing. And I want you to know, I'm here for you. Whatever you need." Tears sprang to my eyes at her words. "Thank you," I whispered. "That means more than you know." As I hung up the phone, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Sarah's support had reinforced my decision, reminding me that I wasn't alone, even if I was starting a new life. The next morning, I checked out of the motel and hit the road, pointing my car south towards North Carolina. As I drove, I felt a mixture of excitement and terror. I was heading towards an unknown future, leaving behind everything familiar. But as the miles rolled by, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, it was my future to shape. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. I was no longer Mrs. Thomas Aldridge, the perfect lawyer's wife. I was Claire, just Claire. And I was finally, truly free. The drive to North Carolina was long, but with each mile that passed, I felt the weight of my old life falling away. As I crossed the state line, a sense of possibility washed over me. This was it, the start of my new life. My apartment in Asheville was small but charming, located in a vibrant neighborhood filled with artists and young professionals. It was a far cry from the sprawling suburban home I'd left behind, but as I turned the key in the lock for the first time, it felt more like home than that house ever had. The first few days were a whirlwind of activity. I unpacked my meager belongings, bought some basic necessities, and started to familiarize myself with my new surroundings. The city had a relaxed, creative vibe that resonated with me. People smiled at strangers on the street, and no one seemed to care about designer labels or social status. It was refreshing. As I settled into my new routine, I found myself rediscovering simple pleasures I'd forgotten. I spent hours in local coffee shops, savoring drinks I chose based on taste rather than trendiness. I explored the numerous bookstores, losing myself in volumes I'd always wanted to read but never had the time for. I even started sketching again, something I hadn't done since college. But it wasn't all easy. There were nights when the silence in my small apartment felt oppressive, when doubts crept in and I questioned every decision I'd made. On those nights, I'd wrap myself in a blanket and sit by the window, watching the city lights and reminding myself why I'd left. I thought often of Tom and the life I'd left behind. Had he filed for divorce yet? Was he looking for me? Sometimes, in my weaker moments, I was tempted to call, to hear his voice one last time. But I resisted. I knew that any contact would only muddy the waters, pulling me back into a world I was trying so hard to leave behind. Instead, I focused on building my new life. I threw myself into job hunting with a fervor that surprised me. I applied for marketing positions, writing jobs, anything that would allow me to use my skills and creativity. It was harder than I expected. My resume had gaps, and I struggled to explain my employment history without mentioning my ex-husband. But I persevered. I took on freelance writing gigs to build up my portfolio, wrote a blog about starting over in your 30s, and even started volunteering at a local women's shelter. Slowly but surely, I was creating a new identity for myself, one that had nothing to do with being someone's wife. About a month into my new life, I received a call from a local marketing firm. They were impressed with my portfolio and wanted to interview me for a junior copywriter position. The salary was less than half of what Tom used to make in a month, but it was mine. All mine. The day of the interview, I stood in front of my mirror, trying to decide what to wear. In my old life, I would have reached for a designer suit, something impressive and intimidating. But as I looked at my reflection, I realized I didn't want to be that person anymore. Instead, I chose a simple blouse and trousers, comfortable but professional. I let my hair fall in its natural waves instead of straightening it into submission. And for the first time in years, I felt like myself. The interview went well. I was nervous, but also excited in a way I hadn't been in years. I talked about my ideas, my passion for writing, my desire to create meaningful content. When they asked about the gap in my employment history, I was honest. I was in a situation that wasn't allowing me to grow, I said. So I made the difficult decision to start over. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. To my surprise, the interviewer nodded in understanding. That takes courage, she said. We value that kind of resilience here. 2 days later, they offered me the job. As I hung up the phone after accepting, I felt a surge of pride so strong it brought tears to my eyes. This was my achievement, my success. No one could take it away from me. As weeks turned into months, I settled into my new routine. My days were filled with work, writing, and exploring my new city. I made friends, real friends, people who liked me for who I was, not for who I was married to or what I could do for them. There was Maria, a graphic designer I met at work, who introduced me to salsa dancing and taught me to curse in Spanish. There was Jake, my neighbor, a kindergarten teacher with a wicked sense of humor who always seemed to know when I needed cheering up. And there was Lena, a fellow volunteer at the women's shelter, whose strength and resilience never failed to inspire me. With their support, I started to rediscover parts of myself I'd thought were long gone. I took art classes, joined a hiking group, even tried my hand at stand-up comedy at a local open mic night. Some endeavors were more successful than others. Turns out I'm not cut out for stand-up, but each experience helped me grow, helped me figure out who I was without the constraints of my old life. One sunny Saturday, about 6 months after I'd left Boston, I decided to tackle the one thing I'd been avoiding, my wedding ring. It had sat in my jewelry box since the day I'd arrived in Asheville, a glittering reminder of the life I'd left behind. I took it to a local jeweler, a kind-faced woman named Ruth. She examined the ring carefully, then looked at me with understanding in her eyes. "It's a beautiful piece," she said. "What would you like to do with it?" I took a deep breath. "I'd like to sell it," I said. "And, if possible, I'd like to use some of the gold to make something new. Something for me." Ruth smiled. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said. "Let's design something together." Over the next hour, Ruth and I sketched and discussed. In the end, we decided on a simple pendant, a small, golden bird in flight. As Ruth wrote up the order, she looked at me curiously. "If you don't mind me asking," she said, "what does the bird symbolize for you?" I thought for a moment. "Freedom," I said finally. "And new beginnings." Ruth nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Perfect," she said. 2 weeks later, I picked up my new necklace. As I fastened it around my neck, I felt a sense of closure. The last tangible link to my old life had been transformed into something new, something that represented who I was becoming. That night, I sat on my small balcony, watching the sun set over the mountains. I thought about how much had changed in just 6 months. I had a job I loved, friends who valued me for who I was, and a growing sense of who I wanted to be. Sure, my life wasn't perfect. My apartment was small, my savings were dwindling, and there were still nights when I woke up reaching for someone who wasn't there. But for the first time in years, I was excited about the future. I was living life on my own terms, making my own choices, following my own path. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, I touched the small golden bird at my throat. I thought about the girl I used to be, the woman I'd become in my marriage, and the person I was now. Each version of me had led to this moment, this new beginning. I didn't know what the future held. Would I stay in Asheville forever? Would I find love again? Would I achieve all the dreams I was finally allowing myself to have? I didn't know. But I did know one thing. Whatever happened, I would face it as myself. No more masks, no more pretending. I was Claire. Just Claire. And that was more than enough. The next morning, I woke up to an email that made my heart race. It was from Tom's lawyer. For a moment, I was tempted to delete it without reading, to maintain the clean break I'd worked so hard to achieve. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. With trembling hands, I opened the email. It was a formal notice of divorce proceedings. Tom was filing on grounds of abandonment. There was a list of assets to be divided, a cold, clinical breakdown of the life we'd shared. At the bottom was a personal note from Tom. "Claire, I hope you're happy with your decision. I never thought you'd do something like this. If you're ready to be an adult about this, please contact my lawyer. We need to sort this out." I read the email 3 times, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. Anger at Tom's condescending tone. Relief that he wasn't trying to force me to come back. Fear about the legal battle that was sure to come. But underneath it all was a steady calm. This was the final step. Once this was done, I would truly be free. I forwarded the email to Sarah, who had put me in touch with a lawyer friend of hers in Boston. Then I closed my laptop, got dressed, and headed to work. I had a life to live, and I wasn't going to let this derail me. That evening, as I sat in my favorite coffee shop working on a new marketing campaign, I realized something. The email from Tom, which would have sent me into a tailspin of anxiety just a few months ago, was just another item on my to-do list now. Important, yes, but not life-defining. I looked around the coffee shop, at the eclectic mix of people typing on laptops, chatting with friends, sketching in notebooks. I thought about my coworkers, my new friends, the life I was building here. None of these people knew or cared about my past. To them, I was just Claire, the copywriter, the hiker, the amateur artist, the friend. And I realized, with a sense of profound relief, that's who I was to myself now too. The chains of my old life, which had felt so heavy for so long, had finally fallen away. I was living a new life, a life without chains. And I was never going to let anyone shackle me again. As the weeks turned into months, my new life in Asheville began to feel less like an escape and more like a rebirth. The divorce proceedings loomed in the background, a constant reminder of the life I'd left behind, but they no longer held the power to derail my days or keep me up at night. Working with Sarah's lawyer friend, I navigated the complex process of untangling my life from Tom's. It wasn't easy. There were heated exchanges over assets, accusations thrown back and forth through our lawyers. Tom seemed determined to paint me as irresponsible, unstable, undeserving of any part of the life we'd built together. But I stood my ground. With each conference call, each email exchange, I felt stronger. I wasn't fighting for money or possessions. I was fighting for my right to choose my own path, to live life on my own terms. One particularly tough day, after a grueling negotiation session, I found myself walking through the botanical gardens near my apartment. As I strolled among the vibrant flowers and peaceful ponds, I reflected on how far I'd come. A year ago, I would have been devastated by the harsh words and accusations Tom had thrown at me today. I would have second-guessed myself, wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe I was selfish for walking away. Maybe I didn't deserve anything. But now, surrounded by the beauty of nature, I felt a deep sense of peace. I knew who I was. I knew what I deserved. And I wasn't going to let anyone, not Tom, not his lawyer, not anyone, make me doubt myself again. As I sat on a bench, watching a family of ducks glide across a pond, my phone buzzed with a message from Maria, inviting me to a salsa class that evening. I smiled, realizing that a year ago, I would have declined, worried about what Tom would think or if it would interfere with his schedule. Now, I typed out an enthusiastic yes, without hesitation. This was my life now, my choices, my adventures. That night, as I laughed and stumbled my way through the salsa steps with Maria and our other friends, I felt a rush of joy so pure it almost brought tears to my eyes. This was what living felt like. This was what I'd been missing for so long. As the months passed, the divorce proceedings began to wind down. Tom, realizing that I wasn't going to back down, finally agreed to a settlement that was, if not entirely fair, at least acceptable. As I signed the final papers, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was over. I was truly free. To celebrate, my friends threw me a divorce party. It wasn't the kind of bitter, angry affair you might expect. Instead, it was a celebration of new beginnings. We ate, drank, danced, and laughed. My friends had put together a scrapbook of memories from the past year, photos of hikes we'd taken, artwork I'd created, silly selfies from nights out. As I flipped through the pages, I was struck by how happy I looked in every photo. How alive. How much like myself. The next day, nursing a slight hangover but feeling lighter than I had in years, I decided it was time to take another step forward. I'd been avoiding social media since I left, worried about what I might see or who might try to contact me. But now, I felt ready to reclaim that part of my life too. I created new accounts using my maiden name. I carefully curated my friend list, including only those who truly mattered to me. And then, with a deep breath, I made my first post. New name, new city, new life. Here's to fresh starts and the courage to chase them. Hashtag starting over, hashtag Ashleyville Adventures. The response was overwhelming. Old friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out with words of support and encouragement. College classmates I'd lost touch with sent messages saying they were proud of me. Even a few of my former neighbors, who must have heard through the grapevine about what happened, sent kind notes. It wasn't all positive, of course. There were a few snarky comments, a couple of judgmental messages. Tom's sisters both unfriended me within hours. But I found that these things didn't bother me like they once would have. I simply deleted the negative comments, blocked the unkind messengers, and moved on. This was my story to tell, my life to live. I didn't owe anyone explanations or apologies. As I settled into my new reality, I found myself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the scared, unsure woman I'd been on that birthday night, the one who'd finally found the courage to walk away. I thought about all the small steps and big leaps that had led me to this point. One evening, sitting on my small balcony and watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I felt an urge I hadn't experienced in years. I wanted to write. Not just the copy for work or the occasional blog post, but really write. Tell my story. Maybe, I thought, by sharing my experience, I could help other women who felt trapped, who were afraid to take that first step towards freedom. I opened my laptop and began to type. The words flowed out of me, a torrent of emotions and memories, triumphs and setbacks. I wrote about the slow erosion of my self-esteem in my marriage, the constant small compromises that had added up to a life I didn't recognize. I wrote about the fear and exhilaration of leaving, the challenges of starting over. And I wrote about the joy of rediscovery, the thrill of making my own choices, the deep satisfaction of building a life that was truly my own. I wrote through the night, pausing only to refill my coffee cup. As the first light of dawn began to streak the sky, I sat back, exhausted but exhilarated. I had done it. I had told my story. Over the next few weeks, I revised and polished my narrative. I shared drafts with Sarah and my new friends, incorporating their feedback and encouragement. And finally, with a mix of terror and excitement, I submitted my story to a popular women's magazine. To my shock and delight, they wanted to publish it. The editor called it raw, honest, and inspiring. As I read over the final proof, I felt a sense of closure. This was the final step in my journey, sharing my story, in hopes that it might help others find their own courage. The day my article was published, I received an unexpected email. It was from Tom's younger sister, Emma. Of all of Tom's family, Emma had always been the kindest to me, though our relationship had been distant at best. Claire, the email read, I just read your article. I had no idea. I'm so sorry for the way we all treated you. I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening, that I didn't try to help. But mostly, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You're incredibly brave, and I hope you're happy in your new life. You deserve it. Tears pricked my eyes as I read Emma's words. It wasn't until that moment that I realized a small part of me had still been seeking validation from my old life. Emma's email was like the final key, unlocking a door I hadn't even known was still closed. I wrote back, thanking Emma for her kind words. We agreed to keep in touch, a small but meaningful connection to my past. In the weeks that followed, I received countless messages from women who had read my article. Some shared their own stories of leaving unhappy relationships. Others confided that they were still gathering the courage to make a change. Many simply thanked me for putting into words what they had been feeling. Each message reinforced what I had come to believe. There is immense power in walking away. Not in anger or bitterness, but with purpose and self-respect. Walking away from what no longer serves you, from relationships that diminish you, from a life that feels like a constraint rather than an opportunity. As I responded to these messages, offering what encouragement and support I could, I felt a new purpose emerging. I started a blog, sharing more of my experiences and insights. I began volunteering more hours at the women's shelter, working with women who were taking their own first steps towards independence. 1 year to the day after I had left my old life behind, I stood in front of a room full of women at a local community center. I had been invited to speak about my experience, to share what I had learned about starting over. As I looked out at the faces turned towards me, some eager, some anxious, all searching for something, I felt a surge of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Walking away isn't easy, I told them. It's scary and painful, and there will be days when you question everything. But let me tell you something I've learned. Walking away from what's wrong for you is the first step towards finding what's right. I shared my story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I talked about the challenges I'd faced, the doubts I'd overcome. But mostly, I talked about the joy of rediscovery, the exhilaration of living life on my own terms. The power of walking away isn't in the leaving, I concluded. It's in what you walk towards. It's in the life you build, the person you become when you're free to be your true self. As I finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Women came up to hug me, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. In their eyes, I saw reflected the same fear and hope that had driven me a year ago. Later that night, as I walked home under a sky full of stars, I felt a profound sense of peace. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, scared, unsure, but determined to find a better life. I thought about all the challenges I had faced, all the growth I had experienced. And I realized that walking away had given me so much more than I had ever imagined. It had given me strength, resilience, and a deep understanding of my own worth. It had given me the power to shape my own life, to write my own story. As I reached my apartment, I paused to look up at the night sky. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities. I didn't know exactly what it held, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. I was Claire. Just Claire. And that was more than enough.